We all knew this update was coming. We knew it was going to be huge, and that it was probably one of the most challenging projects SCS Software has ever attempted. What we didn't know is whether this rework was actually possible, and if so, how much could it actually change things for both ETS2 and ATS. Even after following the development blogs, the screenshots and all the updates, its success remained uncertain until we could actually play it. A few days ago, update 1.59 released, and together with that came the completion of Project Benelux. Today, I want to talk about how this rework actually feels, why it was so difficult to pull off, and most importantly, what this tells us when looking at the future of these games. About 1 year ago, on February 22nd of 2025, SCS Software officially announced the beginning of Project Benelux Rework for ETS2. The goal was simple, at least on paper, to rebuild one of the oldest regions in the game and bring it up to the modern ETS2 standards that feel closer to the newer DLCs or other reworked areas like the Swiss Alps or Germany. However, the more we learned about the project, it became pretty clear that this was going to be anything but simple. Why? Well, to put it simply, Benelux is one of the densest regions in Europe. As the name suggests, the region is made up of 3 countries: Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Small countries by size, but incredibly dense, all packed with massive motorways networks, ports, industrial zones, interchanges, canals, cities, all constantly flowing into each other. The tricky part was that SCS Software had to figure out a way to fit it all within ETS2's 1/19 scale, while somehow still preserving the identity and atmosphere of these places. From the very beginning, SCS talked about how authenticity was one of the main priorities of this rework. And for me, the whole premise made this project extremely interesting to follow. Besides rebuilding Benelux to look better, I was eager to learn how they will manage to compress one of the busiest and most infrastructure-heavy parts of Europe into ETS2's 1/19 scale without losing its believability. This is a topic for another day, but after reviewing this rework, I think we could better judge how SCS Software might plan to approach the East Coast of American Truck Simulator in a similar manner. So for the question, was this rework a success? Absolutely. As soon as you start driving through the reworked area, you can immediately understand why this project was so difficult to pull off. One thing that I noticed right away was just how dense everything feels now. I don't necessarily mean dense in terms of traffic or visual clutter. I mean the actual road network itself. The amount of interchanges, exits, industrial zones, and constant changes happening around you while you're driving is like nothing we've seen before. There's a strong and constant feeling that the road ahead is constantly asking for your attention, especially around places like Rotterdam or Antwerp, where the motorway networks start becoming slightly chaotic. It genuinely captures how it feels to be driving through a logistic-heavy region. And what impressed me the most is that despite ETS2 scale, with the limitations that we all know, it rarely feels random or compressed just for the sake of compression. And based on comments of other players who actually live in that area and my thorough research and playtime in that region, I'm happy to say that this is probably the best they could have done with this game's scale. So you know me, I'm calling it as it is with no false modesty. I think SCS absolutely nailed this rework. And this is the kind of immersion that screenshots alone could never really show, and I'm sure once you get to drive it yourself, you'll fully relate to what I just said. Let's talk about the main additions and the main changes. This rework remains pretty consistent almost everywhere you go. Each major area feels like it received genuine attention and care. However, there are a few locations in particular that genuinely stood out to me while driving through the new Benelux. Amsterdam was probably one of the biggest surprises for me. When you start approaching the city, you can tell how much more modern and believable everything feels compared to what it used to be prior to this update. The skyline of this city itself, it looks fantastic, especially with the elevated motorway sections cutting through the urban area. It creates this really unique perspective while driving that feels very different from the older cities that we were used to. Impressively enough, despite the scale's limitation, the city still manages to feel large in a way, if that makes sense. That's something I noticed multiple times throughout this rework actually. SCS Software became very good at creating the illusion of scale without necessarily needing those realistic distances. Another area that really stood out to me was Rotterdam and the Europort region. It's also probably the place where the true density of this rework shines. It really manages to capture the slightly chaotic feeling of driving through Europe's largest logistic hub. The same thing applies to Antwerp. There's this constant feeling that everything around you is on the move, everything is active. They feel incredibly immersive while driving. And then you have places like Groningen or Eindhoven. Groningen especially surprised me because of how much atmosphere they managed to fit into such a compact area. The canals, the bridges, the overall layout genuinely make it feels like it's Dutch, if that makes sense. Eindhoven, on the other hand, feels much more modern and technology focused, if you will, especially with the inclusion of the DAF facilities, which I believe fits perfectly within a truck simulator like ETS2. And even if you look for the smaller details throughout the rework, they deserve a lot of credit. Things like the truck stops, the gas stations, they are fantastic, and as a first, they don't feel generic. Many of them have their own layouts, own architecture and atmosphere depending on the area you are driving through. And ultimately, I think this rework as a whole is very special. Besides the obvious visual upgrades, the amount of smaller details constantly working together to make the region feel believable are top-notch. So, maybe for the most important thing of this video, after I spent quite a bit of time driving through the new region, reviewing it, taking notes, I think I can safely say that this project matters for a lot more than just Benelux itself looking nicer. In a way, I think SCS Software proved that with smart enough design, even extremely dense regions can still feel believable in these games despite the scale limitations. Realistically speaking, places like Benelux should in fact be one of the hardest things to recreate in a game like ETS2, and yet, somehow, SCS managed to preserve the feeling of these places surprisingly well. That gives me a lot of confidence when thinking about the future, especially when it comes to something like the East Coast and American Truck Simulator, which many people, including myself, were always a bit unsure about because of how dense and compressed that part of the US would need to become. Now, whether the same logic could apply there and it would fully work, we obviously still don't know. But I think that this rework showed us that it might actually be possible without needing to fundamentally change the scale of the game itself. At the very least, SCS still has some time to continue improving the technology before reaching that point. And at the same time though, I do think performance is slowly becoming the biggest bottleneck here. On my high-end PC, the experience overall stayed very playable and consistent, but I would lie if I told you that it was perfect. I noticed more moments where the FPS would suddenly drop, and quite heavily this time, for short period of times, sometimes around 20 to 30% reduction on my FPS depending on the area. Now obviously, performance is always going to depend heavily on your setup, on your mods, on your settings, so your experience may very well be very different from mine. All that considered, while I genuinely rate this rework extremely high, I do think it raises an important question about how far this current engine can continue supporting increasingly dense updates and reworks such as this one in the near future. Still, if this is the direction ETS2 is heading in, and this is what SCS is doing, honestly I'm very excited for what comes next. And as always, until the next time, stay safe on the road and keep on trucking. Cheers!